Good morning. Full house. Class is about to begin. Good morning and welcome to those in Washington and to everyone watching on the Wilson Center website, Facebook Live, and Twitter. We are everywhere. And thank you to members of our corporate council and the Wilson Council's Michael Waller and Ellen Windsor, who are here today. We expect several ambassadors, and we also have friends at ICICI Bank who are here today. Glad you're here. I'm Jane Harmon, Director, President, and CEO of the Wilson Center. And my thanks, too, to our moderator, in purple, in the middle, Elise Labott, Global Affairs Correspondent for CNN. She's reported from more than 75 countries and traveled with 5 secretaries of state, so I think we're in good hands. It's no secret that this past year has been less than ideal for serious policy discussion. Today, our all-star panel of program directors and vice presidents will go beyond the headlines and give us the view from abroad, examining key foreign policy challenges facing the future Trump administration. Let's be clear. Last Tuesday was a shock to the system. To quote the president-elect, it was huge. No matter where you stand on the results, and people who work here stand in different places about those results, few of us who have long experience in politics expected them. My take is, in hindsight, that the strongest message won out: the need to change Washington. For the first time since President Eisenhower, America voted for an outsider who promised to completely rewrite the rules of the game. As a recovering politician, I can tell you that change in Congress doesn't come easily. But things do happen fast on the international stage. It's hard to believe the U.S. election was just a week ago today, and at this hour, last Tuesday, most observers expected Hillary Clinton would win the presidency. We planned this event weeks ago and thought it important to share foreign perspectives on a fairly predictable outcome. But now, with this historic outcome, the information and insights from our experts become far more important. And we plan to bring them to our diverse audiences today and to continue the conversation weekly on different media formats as events unfold. This is something the living memorial to our only PhD president, Woodrow Wilson, can uniquely do and has done for almost 50 years. In his memory, we align the best scholars worldwide, about 120 per year, with the best programs and, of course, the best program directors. So you will hear shortly from Matt Rajansky, just to pick one, director of our Kennan Institute, which housed George F. Kennan as one of the Wilson Center's first fellows in 1974 and has supported over 2,000 scholars in Washington and Eastern Europe in the years since. I'm sure you all know, because we get the smartest audiences, that President Putin called President-elect Trump yesterday. What are the implications? We'll hear what Matt thinks, buttressed by his years studying Russia and amplified by those on the ground in the region. We obviously assess other hard issues like immigration, nuclear proliferation, extremism, China's rise, corruption, women's leadership, from the vantage point of deep scholarship and vast experience. And you'll hear about a lot of that today from other program directors. And all of this happens in our safe political space. That's where you're sitting, in our safe political space, which is on media and physical platforms like this auditorium. In the almost 6 years since I left Congress, I've always been proud to lead this place. Never prouder than now when the issues are so urgent. And before I turn this wonderful panel over to Elise, I just have to say a few words about the pioneer Gwen Ifill, whose grace, grit, and talent were well captured in the obituary on the front page of today's Washington Post, amidst articles on Steve Bannon, Putin, and the changed politics we confront. Yesterday, we lost an incredible woman whom we all knew. Now more than ever, critical and informed journalism is important, and Gwen embodied that. She will be deeply missed in this town. Please welcome another incredible woman, CNN's Elise Labott.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, and thank you to everyone for being here at the Wilson Center for a very important discussion on the international implications of our historic election. I just want to echo what Jane said about Gwen. It's a loss for all journalists and all humanity, because the critical thinking, the wonderful spirit, and the curiosity and warmth that she brought to this job has really been an inspiration to me and so many others. So we will try to carry on in the traditions and the example that she set. As we said, we have a full range of really some of the country's leading experts to talk about the far-reaching implications of the election of Donald Trump, what that means for U.S. leadership in the world, and I think from a perspective of what the leaders around the world and the people in these countries are going to expect from the new president, from the United States. We're going to start close to home with Duncan Wood, the director of the Mexico Institute. Duncan, the president did have a controversial campaign about Mexico, sometimes discussing Mexicans in derogatory terms. But beyond that, talked about this, wall between the United States and Mexico. Talk to us about the reaction in Mexico, and how does President-elect Trump get this relationship back on track, given the fact that there is so much trade, so many people back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico. Our neighbor to the south, we're really so inextricably linked. So this relationship obviously can't be ignored. How does he right the ship and get that back on track? Talk to us about some of the challenges there.
Thank you, Elise. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
It's not on.
No, it's not as much. Hello, hello. Can we get that working? Switch over to mine. Thank you. Alrighty. Much better. Yeah, obviously, as Elise said, there you go, goes my name. As Elise said, Mexico was hit perhaps harder than any other country, thank you so much, during the election campaign. And it's easy to forget now that it wasn't just Mr. Trump that mentioned Mexico in a negative context. In fact, even in Bernie Sanders' letter that was published the other day, we saw that Mexico was mentioned in the context of jobs leaving the United States. Now, this brought a horrified reaction in Mexico, because the Mexican government over the last few years has tried incredibly hard to emphasize the interdependent nature of the economic relationship. We have just completed a study here at the Wilson Center, in fact, called Growing Together, where we've established that almost 5 million jobs here in the United States depend upon the trading relationship with Mexico, directly and indirectly. And we've gone through state by state, and we've discovered that, for example, in California, over 595,000 jobs depend upon the trading relationship with Mexico. And that's a net figure. That is not that takes into consideration the jobs that have indeed left the United States to go to Mexico, but it takes into consideration the jobs that have been created because of the economic relationship. And so Mexicans reacted with horror to the idea that perhaps NAFTA was being called into question. Obviously, the idea of the wall holds enormous symbolic value in Mexico, campaigning for years to resist more barriers on the border. And of course, some of the derogatory comments about Mexicans themselves hit hard. Throughout the election campaign, we saw reactions from former presidents, first of all, of Mexico. President Vicente Fox came out, first of all, in very, very strong terms. And then we saw the previous president, Felipe Calderón, come out as well. And that kind of drew the current president, Enrique Peña Nieto, to make statements against Donald Trump's rhetoric during the election campaign. In the end, as it became clear that there was a chance that Trump might win, the finance secretary in Mexico, a guy called Luis Videgaray, reached out to the Trump campaign and invited him to visit Mexico. They also reached out to Hillary Clinton's campaign. And the idea was here to try to establish a channel of communication so that in the event of a Trump victory, markets, financial markets, wouldn't react too badly. Now, that invitation and the correspondent visit by Mr. Trump to Mexico City was widely denounced in Mexico in the press. It was one of the least popular acts of this administration in Mexico. And, of course, now, after Trump has won, it's being reevaluated. There's a certain amount of revisionist history going on, and people are saying, well, this finance minister is in fact a genius. He saw the future, and he's coming back into the inner circle. Now, of course, he didn't know what the results were going to be, but he was hedging his bets. As a good finance minister would do, he recognized the vulnerability of the Mexican economy, of the Mexican currency, the peso, and of Mexican government finances. In fact, the Mexican peso this year has been hit harder than any other currency around the world. It's lost more value than even the British pound. So we've seen the Mexican peso slide to over 20 pesos to the dollar, from a period of from a point a couple of years ago when it was at around 12.5 pesos to the dollar. That's a significant slide in the value of the currency, and it's created a great deal of uncertainty in Mexico. Now, part of the reason for that is not just because of the wall or because Mr. Trump made derogatory comments about Mexicans. It was really all about the impact of a much more closed approach to international trade, and in particular, a possible renegotiation of NAFTA or an abrogation of the NAFTA. And what we've seen is that since Mr. Trump's victory last week, with a softening of his stance on a number of policy issues, the Mexican peso has begun to stabilize. In fact, yesterday it had a 1% gain, showing that the markets have now incorporated the shock into their calculations. And there is a little bit more optimism about the future. I think that what we're seeing right now is that the Mexican government is building upon its earlier actions to invite Mr. Trump. Immediately there was a phone call from President Peña Nieto to Mr. Trump to congratulate him. And in that phone call, they talked about the need to have a meeting before the Trump administration begins in January. And so we will see a meeting between the Mexican president and the U.S. president-elect. And the question now is, what are we going to talk about? In their meeting in Mexico City in September, they talked about the wall, and there's a dispute about whether or not they decided who was going to pay for the wall. But of course, since the election, we've seen that leading Republicans have come out and said, we don't expect the Mexicans to pay for that. But that was a damn good campaign slogan, wasn't it? And we're seeing now that there is a pragmatism on the part of the Mexican administration, a recognition of the need to engage, because the economic relationship is simply too important. The economic relationship is the foundation of Mexican prosperity. And so the last thing that they can actually accept is that there will be some kind of closing of the U.S. border to Mexican imports. And of course, the case that they're going to make in the conversation with Mr. Trump is that closing the U.S. border to Mexican imports would be bad not just for Mexico, but for U.S. manufacturing as well, for the simple reason that U.S. manufacturing depends so heavily on inputs, the importation of intermediary goods from Mexico for the production process, that integrated production platform in North America, the integrated supply chain upon which so many American firms depend, is simply too valuable to put at jeopardy.
Thanks, Duncan. Appreciate that thoughtful look at some of the possibilities and also some of the concerns. Cynthia, let's go further south and talk about the region as a whole. Cindy Arnson is the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. These harsh anti-immigrant positions weren't just about Mexico. They were also about, broadsides against NAFTA. And I think when Donald Trump talked about Mexico, I think people in Latin America and maybe the whole hemisphere took that as a code for the whole region. So given what Duncan laid out in terms of trade, and also there is so much cooperation on non-economic issues such as terrorism, such as countering narco trafficking, countering terrorism. Talk about the landscape in which the president will need to continue to nurture these relationships, given the concern about the negative attitude that these people in the region now feel a large part of the American electorate has about the region.
Thank you, Elise, and thanks for that question. I think, as you mentioned, Latin America was not part of the U.S. electoral campaign, with the exception of Mexico, the broadsides against trade and against immigration. But even though those things were narrowly aimed at Mexico, they were taken, as you said, as codes for the way President-elect Trump or the Trump administration would deal with Latin America. And I think there's a great deal of concern. There's also, I think, a sense of shock in the region, in countries that have gone through very difficult transitions from dictatorship to democracy, that believe in free elections and that believe in open economies, to see the United States, the sort of flagship of democratic governance around the world, having an electoral outcome such as the one that we saw last Tuesday. There's a way in which, in many Latin American countries, there's a reaction that we have seen this movie before. We have lived through this movie, and it is not a good movie. There have been recent elections in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru that have reaffirmed the value of democratic principles, of open markets, of openness to the international global economy, and the actual costs of going the other way in a much more protectionist direction. The poster childs of that, perhaps no one better than Argentina and Brazil. So there is a sense that many governments have adopted the prescriptions that in a lot of ways emanated from Washington, not just from the U.S. government, but from international financial institutions about the value of openness. And now they're seeing the United States turn its back on those principles. I also think that there's a great deal of fear of a return to a unilateralist foreign policy that was largely rejected during the Bush years, and because of the enormous commodity boom and the way South American economies benefited from that boom, caused South America mostly to be looking east towards China, towards Asia, and there was a delinking from the United States. Some of that has been recovered with the change in elections and the changes that has brought about. There's also a concern in a country like Colombia or a region like Central America that has forged deep cooperative relationships with the United States on security issues, on counter-drug issues, and on the effort to build more inclusive societies, that the United States now will either cut back drastically on foreign assistance or focus narrowly on the security dimensions of those problems. If you want to fight narco-trafficking or prevent immigration, you have to build opportunities for young people to be legally or to be inserted in the legal economy. And you can't just have a one-sided policy. It has to be multifaceted. So all of these, it is not a simple world. It is a complex world. The complexity of dealing with the transition in Venezuela is going to take cooperation. It's not going to take just the United States dictating what should happen. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity for moving ahead in a collaborative way, but most people are looking with alarm at what just took place in the United States and wondering about what a new Trump administration will do vis-a-vis the rest of the region.
Thanks, Cindy. Matt Rojansky is the director of the Kinnan Institute. It seems as if the election of Vladimir Putin in Russia was kind of a third party in this election, if you will. A lot of accusations back and forth, a lot of scrutiny of a supposed coziness between the candidate and his aides and the Russian government. But I think that sets up an expectation of what the relationship between the U.S. and Russia is going to be like. Donald Trump is going to team up with Vladimir Putin. They're going to go against ISIS. There's an expectation, perhaps, that Russia will get a pass on some of its aggressive behavior in Ukraine and the Middle East. But talk to us about how Donald Trump needs to navigate this relationship. There's a lot of concern for years about Vladimir Putin and Russia's growing aggressive tendencies around the world, but there's also so much critical cooperation that goes on between the U.S. and Russia, and there are concerns now with Vladimir Putin putting nuclear-capable missiles on NATO's doorstep to its actions in Syria, that the cooperation that both countries tried to set up, that reset that never happened, is really kind of off the rails. How does he get it back on track?
Well, thanks, Elise, and thank you, Jane, for convening this forum, because I think it's rare in the aftermath of an event that tends to reset, no pun intended, a lot of people's expectations, that we have a chance to be descriptive rather than purely prescriptive. We're very good at that in this town. We write a lot of papers and op-eds and things that say, this is what so-and-so should do. I think the important questions at this moment are, what's going on, what's happening. And I've been, like many probably, absolutely glued to the front pages of newspapers, learning about what's happening in our country. And the wider world, of course. And so for my little slice of it, not so little, I suppose, it's a big enough slice that no one scholar's wisdom suffices. But I will say George F. Kennan would be someone I wish was around to provide us counsel right now. There's a lot of times when I wish that. What I'd start with is yesterday's call between President-elect Trump and President Putin. All I can say is that from my vantage point, this appeared to be basically a follow-up on his congratulatory telegram. I think Putin very wisely sent a telegram rather than calling Trump. He got that telegram in quickly, which is an important thing for any world leader to do, but he didn't call and thus create the impression that, sort of he was intervening too much in the Trump campaign in the immediate afterglow. But they did need to have a conversation, and it's good that that conversation was frankly pretty short, that it was positive, that it was very open-ended. They did not get into any substantive negotiation. I think what we're seeing still is a bit of a hangover in the reporting on this from the campaign phase, where there was just a constant blow-by-blow of what are the Russians doing and saying about either or both of the campaigns. I mean, honestly, the phone call was a protocol phone call. There wasn't really a story there, and if you read the reporting on it, there's not much in it. Now, that said, there's some interesting stuff going on in Russia with respect to the outcome of the U.S. election. There was an initial wave of triumphalism. You certainly saw reporting about the parties in Moscow, people toasting the victory as if it was their victory, this sort of notion of a third candidate in the race. I think that's pretty superficial, and I think Russians are also coming around pretty quickly to the recognition of how superficial, in fact, that is. The fact of the matter is there's really no force or figure in the U.S. election that was advocating for Russia's interests. They have different views of what American interests are, and that's a debate that we're going to have here in Washington. It certainly doesn't solve any problems for Russia. What it does do is create a possible opening. This is an interesting moment where, in effect, during the campaign, candidate Trump paid the political price for saying he wanted to talk to Russia. He wanted to get along with Putin. He maybe wanted to cooperate with Russia in combating ISIS and so on. There was a political cost to that. In the end, I think it was not sufficient to derail his campaign, but it certainly cost him. Having done that, he can now, I think, pivot at relatively minimal cost and actually do those things. And I think those things would be smart if they're possible. For instance, the Obama administration, in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis and Russia's annexation of Crimea, imposed a multifaceted pressure strategy or cost strategy, which included an isolation component. The problem with this isolation strategy has been that every time the United States is forced to talk to the Russians, which happens pretty frequently, we look weak and we look like our strategy is unraveling. That's generally not a good way to go about advancing your interests through diplomacy, and we have to do diplomacy. There's really no other option. So President-elect Trump will come in with the opportunity to do things the United States has got to do, irrespective of whether we can achieve his bigger goals with Russia, and I think many of us have questions about what those are. I think also on the Russian side, there's a real narrative dilemma that's been provoked by this victory, to the extent that the story was that Hillary Clinton, as a continuation and representative of the American establishment, sought to surround and weaken Russia, that she, in 2011 and 2012, helped to orchestrate protests that were designed at decapitating the Russian regime, a so-called color revolution on the streets of Russia, and that she would, in office, continue to do the same thing. Well, now that narrative has clearly been disrupted. And so the question is, with elections of his own in 2018, where Vladimir Putin has got to at least go through the process of running an election and having people turn out and signal their support for him, how does he rejigger a narrative that doesn't depend, on what would be basically a total contradiction with what he's been saying for the last 6 months? This is a guy who wants to talk, who wants to negotiate, who wants to cooperate. So does he go for the American boogeyman, or does he look for something else to reset this narrative? But certainly he needs something for domestic political purposes. I think the Russians are also asking a question that many of us are asking, which is, personnel is policy, and who's actually going to be running the policy within a Trump administration. It will make an enormous difference, and I'll give you the most concrete example that comes to mind for me, is that President-elect Trump's own running mate, Mike Pence, in the course of the vice presidential debate barely a month ago, explicitly disagreed with Trump on Russia and on Putin. And now he's running the transition, and certainly some of the folks who've been talked about as possible leading foreign policy and national security figures in the administration would have a very, I would say, traditionally kind of Washington establishment skeptical position on Putin and a hawkish approach on Russia. And then lastly, of course, the big question for Russians, for international investors, for much of Europe is the question about sanctions. I think it's not unreasonable to ask whether there's some kind of clock now on a sanctions policy, but not so much because of the result of the U.S. election. I don't think Trump ever promised he was going to be dropping sanctions from day one. I think just as a tactical matter, it would be unwise to give up leverage that someone else has paid the political cost for, namely the Obama administration. Why not use it as a bargaining chip? But that said, it's mostly because they haven't worked. They haven't actually delivered the change in Russian policy that Washington had hoped for. All of that said, Europe is really still the key actor on sanctions. It's European sanctions that bite on Moscow. It's not American sanctions. And so whatever signals the new administration sends or doesn't send, it's going to depend on how they're interpreted in Berlin and Brussels and Paris, et cetera. So I think there's very much of a wait and see. Maybe that's not surprising, but those are the kinds of questions I think the Russians are asking.
Thanks, Matt. Robert Daly is the director of the Kissinger Institute for China and the United States. Donald Trump laid out a bit of a combative attitude towards China. China is raping the United States. He wants to get back on an even footing with China. But there's also, he talked about, working with China on North Korea and some of the other things. So I think that there's a lot more complexities that we haven't really been discussing during the campaign to the relationship with China. What are the Chinese expecting? Are they expecting a Donald Trump that's going to be very combative, that's going to label them a currency manipulator, that's going to spark a trade war? Or is this someone a businessman that they see that they can find areas of common ground and cooperation? Thanks.
Well, thank you. The Chinese are sophisticated and practiced observers of American elections. They know how to listen to campaign rhetoric, but they are asking the question that you have just outlined, actually, who is going to show up, who is going to be in the White House. Xi Jinping, the secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, like Putin, made a call to President-elect Trump. It was very responsible, it was very reasonable, it was very brief. And they talked about cooperation being the only possible track for the U.S. and China. And Xi also got in his favorite phrase, we have to pursue win-win solutions, which wags in the American military have said they've come to realize in the Chinese case mean that China wins twice. That's what win-win is about. So they have listened to the many Trump statements throughout the campaign, and these have been parodied on YouTube, where you see Trump's lips pronouncing China, China hundreds of times. But it's clear to China that those statements about raping the United States, about currency manipulation, don't derive from deep systematic thought about the nature of U.S.-China relations. They derive from an obviously accurate instinct about what Americans wanted to hear China was doing pursuant to winning votes. And so that is really water under the bridge as far as China is concerned, a sophisticated response. When you look at the press and the what their equivalent of the Twitterverse, you find in China as in Russia, Matt mentioned a degree of triumphalism. The election reinforced two major Chinese narratives about the United States, which I think have a lot of purchase both in leadership circles and in popular circles, one of which is that American democracy is failing, and that this was a good example of that because it seemed so comical and uncontrolled. And second, that the United States is in long-term decline. And this also reinforces that narrative. And some of the triumphalism, I think, stems from that. I don't know, Matt, whether that's true in the Russian case as well. But that's countered by a deep awareness that the United States has considerable current advantages in both hard and soft power in the region. China is extremely aware of this, and it's aware of its own fragility and its own vulnerability because the Chinese economy is slowing down and it still needs a strong economic and trade relationship with the United States. So they're not quite sure how to hedge their bets here. That's one reason why I think you may have read in the Financial Times and other analyses which suggested that China was going to want to test Trump early on. I think that's wrong. China does not have an interest in testing Trump. They are going to be patient and wait and see what Trump's appointments are. Again, personnel is policy, and what his next moves are. They don't have an interest in provoking an early crisis or even in forcing a Trump administration to make a decision early on about the nature of its competition and cooperation with China. So I think that they're going to take a wait-and-see approach. They'll be patient because there's a lot at stake. What is at stake is the long-term, and China takes the long-term view, reshaping of regional and world order. This is the issue. And at the Kissinger Institute, we do not have to march in lockstep with Dr. Kissinger's views, but on this one I actually think he's got it just right. And there's a long Goldberg interview with Kissinger in the current issue of The Atlantic, which I recommend to all of you. In the Middle East, which we'll be talking about in a minute, in Russia, we're mostly looking at acute threats to American security. But it is still the case that when we think about long-term threats to American primacy, it's China and only China. I've been struck throughout the election, there's a focus on Russia and Putin and what is his role and what should we be thinking about Putin. It is a mark of the intelligence of Chinese foreign policy that we've not been having that conversation about Xi Jinping and Xi's China and how do we respond to China. That is a victory for the Chinese. They see things going their way in the long run. Obviously, TPP, I think, is now dead and buried. That was the economic pillar of the rebalance to Asia. That is gone. China is going to try to capitalize that in Lima at the APEC meetings right away by pushing its new free trade, well, it's not altogether new, but it's not yet concluded free trade area of the Asia Pacific. China has also seen with the visit of President Duterte of the Philippines and the Prime Minister of Malaysia recently, a tendency of Southeast Asian nations to bandwagon with China in the absence of American leadership. So the question I think that China is now asking, and this gets to your initial question, which I think was well put, is who's going to show up? Is Trump the isolationist, the businessman who is going to want to make deals based on interests, but who is unconcerned with human rights and projecting American values? Or is Donald Trump interested in American leadership, which was not part of his campaign rhetoric? It was never clear that making America great again necessarily involved assertion or continuation of American leadership. A very interesting silence in the Make America Great Again discourse of Trump. So that is the question they're asking. Is it going to be about leadership or is it about isolationism? And then just in closing, note that that question, U.S. China balance of power and who will shape international norms, is not just a U.S. China issue. It's an issue in all of these regions.
That's right.
Matt and I work closely
Absolutely.
on the ways that Putin and Xi like to sometimes partner to provide an illiberal but legitimate set of alternatives to liberal norms. It matters for South America. It matters very much for Mexico, for Africa, for the Middle East. China knows this, and this is the question they'll be asking. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. Well, I think that sets us up for the Middle East about American leadership, where leaders in the region have been very concerned that American leadership is on the decline, that the Obama administration might have abandoned its Gulf allies, certainly the inaction in Syria. Do you consider this trend will continue under Donald Trump? What are the leaders in the region expecting from him, and how is that going to shape some of the many conflicts that are going on? You have not only Syria and the fight against ISIS, there's implementation of the Iran deal. There have been mixed signals about what President-elect Trump would do vis-a-vis the Israelis and the Palestinians. And then, there are any number of other issues, Egypt, Libya, Yemen. What is this region looking for from President Trump?
Is that all for me, Lee? First of all, it's terrific to be here with you. And I have to say, every time I listen to my colleagues, I'm reminded of how extraordinary they really are. I mean, their proficiency in regional language, their regional expertise, their capacity to even while they have incredible thematic altitude, to understand the granular when it comes to these issues is, I'm humbled every time I meet with all of you, truly. Look, if Barack Obama's risk aversion was somehow a direct response to George W. Bush's risk readiness, then the real question is, will the next American president be more risk ready or risk averse? And I think that's one of the key questions that we will face in coming months. And I think at the moment there's no real answer. Jonathan Alter wrote, and I think he was right, that all presidents to a large degree are blind dates. Having been through 3 or 4 transitions, I can say that even with the ones that are the most known, that is the case. James Buchanan had the best resume in the presidential biz until Franklin Roosevelt came along, or Teddy Roosevelt, and yet turned out to be one of our worst presidents. I had a call yesterday from an Israeli friend of mine with long experience in the U.S.-Israeli relationship who said, quoting Forrest Gump's mother with that wonderful line that life is like a box of chocolates. You open it up and you never know what you're going to get. I think we really have to be prudent and very humble if we try to assess the reaction of regional leaders a week after an election and 2 months before anyone has put a hand on a Bible to be inaugurated, the 45th President of the United States. That said, based on my contacts in the region in recent days and following the regional press with my friends on all sides of the divide, I think there is a perception of the president-elect of a risk-averse, muscular American nationalist, primarily concerned with American domestic policy, committed to a transformative domestic agenda, as Jane referred, to basically change the political culture and perhaps even the practices of governance. I don't believe in transformations. That may or may not be possible. But that is the perception of the region. There's also the perception, I think, of a man who looks at alliances in terms of business, private sector bottom lines, where you judge the utility, the value, the functional importance of an ally by whether or not the bottom line adds up. And here you have a continuation of the current president's notion and use of the term free rider with respect to Saudi Arabia. You may, in fact, see an intensification of the reality that if you're an ally, a security partner of the United States, then there are certain obligations that you have to undertake. And there is the perception of a man, I think, who is prepared perhaps to take a new look at traditional adversaries or frenemies. In Matt's case, that would be Vladimir Putin. Whether the regional perception of Donald Trump is as a realist in foreign policy is unclear. And Robert Kaplan defined realism the other day as being order before freedom and interests before values. Order before freedom and interests before values. I think that there is, even though Kaplan claimed that Trump is not a realist, I think there is something to that. All of that said, you could probably look and do a sort of immediate survey of regional leaders to try to separate which ones look at the incoming administration with advantage and which ones look at the incoming administration with disadvantage, keeping in mind these criteria. I would put in the advantage category Mr. Putin clearly. Non-substantive or not, I suspect there will be a serious effort to test by this incoming administration whether or not there can be new forms of cooperation, perhaps in places like Syria. President Sisi of Egypt is another one I would put perhaps in the advantage category. I think his perception is that Mr. Trump likes strong authoritarian leaders and is unlikely to push governance, political reform, and human rights as a central tenet of American foreign policy. I would put Mr. Erdogan. Henri Barkey is not here, but I think he would argue that Mr. Erdogan may be a beneficiary as well of the notion of strong leadership, reliable allies who can basically pay for their alliance in various kinds of currency and coin, and little or no sense of doing what Michael Mandelbaum called foreign policy as social work, that is to try to restructure the internal political systems of these countries. Mr. Netanyahu, I think, belongs in a different category, although than the other three, although I think he has welcomed and will see a Trump presidency to his advantage, more space to maneuver on issues with respect to the Iranian nuclear deal and certainly in the Palestinian issue. I would only put one asterisk when it comes to Mr. Netanyahu, and that is Mr. Netanyahu is most comfortable when he is in the center, when he has room to maneuver with the left on one side and his right-wing opponents on the other. And it may well be that the encouragement that Mr. Bennett and others in Israel are taking from comments made by some of Mr. Trump's advisors on issues relating to settlement, whether the two-state solution is relevant to the current situation, will in fact embolden and empower the Israeli right and perhaps cause a few headaches for Mr. Netanyahu. In the just to conclude, disadvantage category, if you were a member of the Syrian opposition committed to continued support from the agency roughly to the tune of $1 billion a year, I think you would look at the incoming administration and wonder whether or not the reliability of that support is going to continue. If you were a Kurd with decentralized and nationalist aspirations in Syria, I wonder, given the propensity to look at strong leaders as friends of the United States, whether or not you could continue to bank on U.S. support. If you are the Saudis, you are probably in the advantaged and the disadvantaged category. You see Mr. Trump's allergies toward the Iranian nuclear deal on one hand as an advantage, but you see the free rider problem on the other. That is to say, what have the Saudis done for me lately problem, which he's already expressed himself. So on balance, I would suspect, and it's early, I cannot stress enough, and I've worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, I cannot stress enough the importance of humility and prudence during these early phases of this campaign, because the realities of campaigning, just to conclude, are one thing. The cruel and unforgiving realities of governing, of keeping this nation prosperous and secure, is another. And I know it's the default position. We shall see.
Thanks, Aaron. Bob Litvak, following so many issues here at Wilson, but we're going to talk about nuclear proliferation and nuclear issues. The Obama administration made nuclear non-proliferation one of the cornerstones of its policy. You had all these summits. There was the cooperative threat reduction. There was a real effort to move towards a world with less nuclear weapons, less reliance on a nuclear threat, trying to combat some of these great threats like Iran with the nuclear deal, obviously North Korea not so successful. Then you have an election campaign in which Donald Trump talked about other countries such as South Korea, Japan, perhaps developing nuclear weapons. The Saudis, to reduce the burden of America, those countries relying on the nuclear umbrella, maybe they should develop nuclear weapons. All of this in the context of what we talked about earlier with Russia in terms of putting nuclear-capable missiles in NATO and kind of upping the ante on the nuclear threat, and North Korea that seems clearly intent on developing a nuclear-capable missile that could hit the United States. Talk to us in terms of what the world is expecting from Donald Trump in terms of nuclear issues. I would expect that there is a lot of concern, and what you see some of the big threats that this new president will have to deal with. Thanks.
Well, last Tuesday's election was a major discontinuity, and what we're grappling with now is what is the magnitude of policy change that will flow from that discontinuity. Let me distinguish between the immediate and the long term, and you laid out a broad agenda there. We can touch on it, but let me just pick out what I think are the immediate issues, the immediate challenges in North Korea and Iran. With North Korea, we're facing the urgent challenge of a strategic breakout. That strategic breakout is quantitative, as North Korea masters miniaturization of warheads and long-range ballistic missiles, and it's qualitative, and it's also quantitative in that they're about to ramp up their warhead arsenal from 20 to perhaps as many as 100. The combination of this qualitative and quantitative breakout poses a direct threat to the United States homeland. With Iran, the new administration faces a hard choice of whether to continue or opt out of the Iran nuclear deal. With both of these hard cases, one can see a broader pattern that has been a persisting tension in our debate, certainly accentuated by the 9/11 attacks, of whether the threat posed by countries like North Korea and Iran derives from their behavior or from the character of the regimes. And the persisting tension has been that the argument has been that the behavior derives from the character of the regime. So in order to turn off the behavior, you have to change regimes. And that, to pick up on the kind of a analytic thread running through Aaron's analysis of whether U.S. policy should be transactional or transformational, that feeds right into the nuclear nonproliferation debate. Because if the approach is that the threat derives from the character of the regime, then behavior change is not going to get you there. You eschew transactional diplomacy to curb the dimensions of the program, because as long as the regime remains in power, the threat is linked to the character of the regime. And that's been the persisting debate there. So what we see now in North Korea is the strategic breakout. It's qualitative with the warhead miniaturization and long-range ballistic missile capabilities that they're acquiring, and it's quantitative with the ramping up of the arsenal in just raw warhead numbers. The Obama administration, after a period of strategic patience with North Korea, is addressing the urgency of this issue, initially by ramping up sanctions and targeting the financial sector to try to replicate the pressure that was brought to bear on Iran. And also, the door is open for diplomatic engagement with North Korea. The objective would be to freeze the North Korean nuclear program. A rollback is not a near-term feasible objective. It would be to freeze the program, to prevent the program, a bad situation from getting worse. Now, the bind is that that's essentially the Iran nuclear deal playbook. That's where the Obama administration is going, and which a Hillary Clinton administration would have continued. The hard choice for the Trump administration is, where do they come out on this divide between realistic transactional diplomacy to try to curb the capabilities, or for the broader objective of a transformational set of policies that would go to what they define as the character of the threat linked to the regime. And that choice will play out in the North Korean context, and it will also play out in the Iranian context. The Iran nuclear deal was transactional. It curbed the program, but it did not address all of the areas of worrisome, threatening Iranian behavior, its support for Hezbollah. You know the litany of issues that are on our list. The Obama administration made the case that to have opted for that type of grand bargain would have led to the collapse of diplomacy because it would not have been an attainable objective. They argue that there is value in the transactional deal that was negotiated, and that curbs Iran's nuclear capabilities. So that with these two hard cases, the Trump administration will have to address this persisting divide in the U.S. debate over transactional versus transformational diplomacy with these hard case countries. One final comment on the long-term persisting threat. As divided as our politics are, there is agreement across the political spectrum that the biggest threat to the United States would be a nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist group. And Elise, you referred to the nuclear security summits the Obama administration convened, which has led to a decrease in the number of states from 35 down to 24 of states with weapons-usable fissile material. If a terrorist group buys a bomb, steals a bomb, or builds a bomb, it's going to rely upon a state, either through an act of negligence or of commission, to either transfer a weapon or the weapon's usable material. So the approach of the Obama administration has been, if we have an effective state-based approach with the 9 nuclear weapon states and the 24 states that have weapons usable material, we lock up those materials, secure them, it cuts off these pathways to terrorist acquisition. I think that is an area of bipartisan agreement that the Trump administration could build on. And Matt Rajansky and I have written a piece on the opening that is there with Russia potentially, which recently opted out of the cooperative threat reduction, of possibly re-engaging Russia to work on this area of core interest to the United States, which is one of mutual interest that we have with Russia.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, a couple of themes that I've kind of picked up from these discussions that I want to throw out to the panel, and then in a few minutes we're going to open it up to your questions. A few things here. One of them is about this kind of transactional way that Donald Trump led this campaign in terms of like a lot of economic bottom line. Are we getting our bang for our buck in terms of some of our relationships and cooperation with some of these other countries? Does that portend to American leadership and this idea that it's on the decline? Is that going to continue to climb? Is Donald Trump more interested in making America great again through not only strength of the economy, but is it about respect, or is it about leadership? He said a lot of times, they don't respect us, they don't fear us, they're gonna fear us again. But he doesn't talk in great terms about American leadership, which I think that was something after the Bush years that President Obama did try to emphasize. How strategic do we think that this president is going to be? I think a lot of it will certainly depend on some of the personnel that he appoints, but I think obviously it takes a few months, if not years, for some kind of doctrine to begin to emerge. What do we see as what can we predict, maybe is the right word, about what kind of Trump doctrine will be? And then the idea that what we've seen is this kind of realignment of the world order. There's been this Western world order in alliances and U.S. world order, whether it's NATO, whether it's APEC, whether it's the G20. And you see countries like Russia, China, and to some extent some of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, Cindy, resist that world order. Does the election of Donald Trump further that trend? How does that shape the opportunities or risks of U.S. leadership around the world? You want to start with that, Rob?
Well, very cognizant of Aaron's warning that I don't think we want to get into prediction or prophecy today. There's so much that we don't know about.
Maybe we're talking
Appointments.
more about some of the pitfalls
But
here.
certainly from the point of view of the nations that have been beneficiaries of the American-led liberal world order, America is garnering more respect, getting bang for its buck, or winning are not components of global leadership. It doesn't mean that a candidate who leads with those slogans cannot then sit down with the right people and think strategically and exercise leadership. So that is the question. It is simply, it hasn't appeared yet in the president-elect's program, but it cannot be written out. I think that we do know that continuing, deepening and this phrase of the world order, it sounds as though it is set in stone and everybody agrees to it and there are no loopholes in it. And of course, none of those things is quite true. Nevertheless, we do know that strengthening that order is going to be a cooperative, consultative process that must acknowledge the increased power of nations that have not been primary players in that order. And so that indicates that we need an administration that has those dispositions to be consultative, to be cooperative, and to also look for flexibility and ways to be more inclusive. That's the challenge, and that's what we need to be looking for. If those dispositions do not emerge, then we are going to see China, we are going to see Russia, we are going to see Turkey, we're going to see other nations moving in.
Elise, could I respond to that? I totally agree with my colleagues that we can't prejudge. We're very early in this transition, and we have no idea who will be named to the actually critical positions in foreign policy. But we can look at what's happening now as President Obama is taking his last international trip, I think today leaving for Greece, but ending in Peru, as Rob mentioned, at the APEC summit, which is an encounter between Latin America and Asia. And he's going there, rather than seeing this as the victory tour of his administration, he is going there with the TPP effectively dead. What is going to be the effect of that? And this is something I think killed by both parties. It might have survived during a lame duck session had Hillary Clinton been elected, but its fate is known. What this will do is make, in the context of Latin America, will make Xi Jinping the hero of the story. It will accelerate the effort of the Latin American and Asian countries that are signatories to the TPP to go on their own without the United States and integrate further, I think, to the detriment of the U.S. economy. It will accelerate the efforts of the Pacific Alliance countries, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, to integrate with Asia, not just China, but Japan and South Korea and India, again, to the detriment of the United States. And it feeds this narrative, which is not just in China, about the general decay and decline of the West and the rise of the East. It totally feeds that narrative in South America, ironically, at a time when they had begun to turn away from that because all of the benefits of the commodities boom in the decade of the 2000s have vanished. And people governments throughout the region are recognizing that, gee, the United States has a lot to offer too in terms of technology and investment and especially in foreign direct investment. So I think that we do know the effect of some of what lays before us.
Okay, Duncan, you want to briefly weigh in?
it's, I guess. I'm having my phone trouble today. There you go. Thank you. Thanks, Robert. I'd like to differ a little bit with what Cindy just said, in the sense that I think that once again this marks the difference between Mexico and the rest of Latin America. You know, Mexico's economic structure is such that disentangling from the United States is nearly impossible.
Right.
And so it's not that Mexico has a choice of going to Asia. They'd like to do Asia as well, but the economic reality is that Mexico depends heavily on the United States. And I think there are two scenarios here whereby Mexico actually benefits. And the first one is that the Trump administration recognizes the importance of keeping sort of liberal international trading or economic relations, and that's good for everybody. And Mexico continues to benefit because it is able to export to the United States, it's able to continue with its economic relationship there, but also grow in the rest of the world. The other one is that a retreat from a liberal international trading order on the part of the American government would emphasize once again how important the region is to the U.S. And Canada and Mexico are really inseparable elements of U.S. competitiveness. And therefore, we'd see, I think, perhaps even more investment coming in from outside of the region into Mexico, the United States, and Canada because of the size of that market. Now, maybe I'm just a Boy Scout optimist here, but I think that there's actually good cause to be optimistic on either front.
Okay. Want to get quickly Matt and Aaron to weigh in, because on one hand, Russia might see this as an opportunity to, as we've been talking about, as Robert laid out, to use this opportunity to reassert its leadership in areas where the U.S. may be retreating a bit under this new president. And certainly, Aaron, your region is one of them.
So I do want to address this question about what I would call a narrative battle between an American narrative and some other narrative. And I think a lot of this stuff is still pretty inchoate. For example, if one of us had to come up with what is exactly the Russian alternate narrative, it's not quite clear we could, or the Chinese. What is the American narrative? I think it has been, for a half century or more, liberal democracy, world order, a liberal world order, and free market prosperity. And I think there are some points of light here. Look, we just ran an election that was highly challenged, that was in some cases tragicomic, outsized role of fringe elements, of money of all kinds, fodder for Saturday Night Live, and yet the unpredictability aspect of democracy is alive and well. The notion that no one bought and paid for and delivered this election with a bow wrapped around it. What happened was the people spoke, and we've had a kind of sea change. And so I think the sense in which the American electoral system, the notion that the people vote, that they elect representatives, and that system is pretty unique and pretty special, that's pretty robust and healthy. Now, do we preserve with that liberal values? Do we preserve with that the open society? Do we then proceed to reinforce the notion of a liberal world order, which requires a firmer hand? Deterrence, for example, ensuring that borders and sovereignty are respected. That's a hard thing to do because it takes resources and it takes firm will. But that's a question that the new administration will face from day one, because you have territory that's now occupied in Europe by a country that used military force. And then on free market prosperity, I'm reminded of George F. Kennan's famous long telegram, where he said, look, the key to the containment strategy isn't playing whack-a-mole. Every time the Soviets crop up somewhere, you send your forces and you defeat them or you deter them. The key to the containment strategy is that you have a vision that's matched by resources that people in, at this point, a war-torn post-World War II Europe who have nothing and are dreaming of having more can actually sign up to. And I think the problem right now is that the American vision has lacked resources for a while, and it's lacked a connection between those resources and a roadmap for where it's going. So if the next administration can put those two pieces together, at least there's something which the Russians, the Chinese, and others may not yet be able to counter.
I mean, yeah, it's complicated questions. I mean, I would argue the world's a much safer place than it was 70 years ago. I mean, Ebola kills 13,000 people. The Spanish flu killed 3% of the world's population, 100 million people. We have 40% fewer conflicts in the world today. But the international system for the United States has become much more complicated. And the notion of indispensability, that the U.S. somehow is the go-to power to fix every problem. De Gaulle says the cemeteries of France are filled with indispensable people. I think the fact of the matter remains that we need to get real about transformational diplomacy and transactional. We need to figure out ways to do effective, smart war-making, if you will, and peacemaking in order to garner the respect, the admiration, and yes, for great power, the fear that characterize American policies when, according to Donald Trump, we were a truly great power. And that, I think, in 2016 is going to be extremely difficult.
Rob, super quickly, but nuclear proliferation has always been an area where the U.S. has led. If the U.S. does not continue to lead on that front, does the whole non-proliferation paradigm fall apart?
No. I mean, John Kennedy famously predicted a world of 35 nuclear weapon states in his 1962 General Assembly speech. We don't live in a world of 35 nuclear weapon states, and the reason is that most states make a hard decision on basis of their existential position that they don't need nuclear weapons, and that a potent weapon instrument in non-proliferation has been the U.S. nuclear deterrence, the nuclear umbrella. And I do think that President Trump has some clarification to do from his campaign statements. He's already begun to make it in phone conversations with world leaders that the United States will provide this type of deterrent umbrella. And that has been a factor that in countries that facing hard choices have thought they can forego their own nuclear weapons programs and rely on the nuclear deterrent. We have the 9 states with nuclear weapons. We're not on the verge of a breakout of anything approaching President Kennedy's nightmare scenario, but we have these persisting hard cases, and as I outlined in my brief remarks, a hard choice that the administration is going to make, whether it will opt for transactional diplomacy to address a discrete, urgent challenge, or be kind of lured into approaching it through a transformational approach, the objective of which no one can question. I mean, the North Korean regime is an odious regime, but it's sort of in functional terms, how do you get from here to there? And they'll have a hard decision to make about where they're going to opt on these. The United States is going to have to do what it has done out of our playbook, which has been articulated by some of my colleagues to address and maintain the current non-proliferation regime.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask you to keep your question very short and pointed. No statements, no prognostications. We have a lot of people that have questions, and we want to try and get to as many as you can. So please just ask your name, identify yourself, and one short question. I'm going to ask Jane to kick it off.
Thank you. Superb panel, superb moderator. My question is whether we need a Trump doctrine, whether we should expect him to come up with a Trump doctrine. It's not us to prognosticate. But over a short period of time, would he be advantaged if he explained across the world, not just to Russia, not just to the Middle East, not just to China, on a transactional basis, but the way to link areas of the world and what his vision is for American power going forward? One could say that President Obama started to do that in his Cairo speech at the beginning